The courtroom fell to a dead silence as the prosecutor stepped up to give his speech. On trial, Dmitry Fyodorovich Karamazov for the crime of murdering his father, Fyodor Karamazov. Just a few hours prior, when asked how he pleaded, Dmitry said, quote, "I plead guilty to drunkenness and depravity, to idleness and debauchery. I intended to become an honest man ever after, precisely at the moment when fate had cut me down. But of the death of the old man, my enemy and my father, I am not guilty. Of robbing him, no, not guilty, and I could not be guilty. Dmitry Karamazov is a scoundrel, but not a thief." The witnesses then came in one after another, each one giving an even more damning testimony than the last. Dmitry had threatened to kill his father repeatedly over the last few months. He was even known throughout the village to be a rowdy, debaucherous scoundrel, picking fights, getting drunk, and quarreling bitterly and loudly. He declared publicly that Fyodor, his father, had owed him 3,000 rubles, more, even more, but he will settle for 3,000, and said that he would take it over his father's cold dead corpse if that's what needed to happen. He had admitted to storming into Fyodor's house and beating him severely a few weeks before the day of his murder. Nearly a dozen witnesses can attest that Dmitry was desperate for money, had asked around for loans, and come up empty. On the night his father was murdered, Dmitry was seen on Fyodor's property and had even struck Grigory, Fyodor's servant, on the head with a pestle. Dmitry was later seen with bloody hands and a bloody coat. He went out of town to throw one final party, where he spent an untold amount of money to hire singers, dancers, as well as host an enormous feast. According to witnesses who spoke to Dmitry, he clearly planned on killing himself after the party was over. Considering the insurmountable evidence, all of Russia was astonished to hear a not guilty plea in the now famous trial. Now, the most notorious defense attorney in the nation stood ready to make the case against all this evidence. The old, local prosecutor was even beginning to get nervous that the winsomeness of the young, brilliant lawyer might win over the crowd and sabotage justice. The jury, after all, are only people. Still, as if just in time, Dmitry's ex-girlfriend showed up as the final witness and presented what was able to be the final nail in the coffin of Dmitry's trial. It was a letter written by him stating that he will kill his father the very next day if he could not obtain a loan of 3,000 rubles, written on a receipt while he was drunk the day before the murder. This was practically a confession. The courtroom was deathly silent. The old prosecutor pushed up his glasses, stood up, and cleared his throat. He moved to the center of the room and was about to give the most powerful and convincing speech of his life. You're listening to the Well-Read Christian Podcast. My name is Mark Stanley, and I'm very thankful that you're joining me for one of my favorite series thus far, Fyodor Dostoyevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. And if you like what you hear, please write a review on iTunes or Facebook. Visit our social media accounts on Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook. Visit our website, wellreadchristian.com, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. So I'm going to leave you in suspense with this court scene, which is actually at the very end of the novel. I thought it was a great way to open, so a little experiment there. We'll see how it pans out. But yeah, sorry, you're in suspense now. And I'm going to tell you all about the book and what we're going to talk about in the next few episodes. And then I'll pick up at the very end and finish that scene because it's going to take a good twist. And the reason for that is because we are just now diving into the pinnacle of Fyodor Dostoyevsky's writing career. And in this book is full of profound ideas, profound conversations, and interesting twists. And it's arguably the pinnacle of Russian literature, and even arguably the peak of world literature. And you know me, at this point, I only read the best. Sigmund Freud called The Brothers Karamazov, quote, the most magnificent novel ever written, end quote. Albert Einstein said that he learned more from Dostoevsky than any other thinker. Franz Kafka is a Bohemian writer and prominent figure of the 20th century, and he said that he was indebted to Brothers Karamazov for his own inspiration. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein took his copy of Brothers Karamazov through World War I and knew several passages by heart. Martin Heidegger, a central figure for phenomenology and existentialism, cited Brothers Karamazov for his groundbreaking work Being in Time. William Faulkner, the American writer and playwright, said that the Brothers Karamazov reaches literary inspiration that parallels Shakespeare and the Bible. There is one specific chapter in Brothers Karamazov called The Grand Inquisitor that has almost taken a life of its own because of its power and intrigue. It's a poem, I suppose, more like a short story, where one of the characters has written this poem, or short story, and in it there's this profound conversation about human nature, free will, and all kinds of interesting things about how tyranny and power relate to free will and human beings and God and that kind of a thing. And it's a very famous Dante-esque pillar of modern literature that continues to inspire and captivate. Aldous Huxley's Brave New World specifically references that chapter explicitly, as does Albert Camus, the French existentialist, in one of his books. I think we'll probably give an entire episode to the Grand Inquisitor if I can work up the courage. So that really says something about the book, if a single chapter can be so powerful and influential. And there are many such chapters in the Brothers Karamazov. So to say that this is Dostoyevsky's best work is probably undeniable. So what does Dostoyevsky's best work look like? Well, it's classic Dostoyevsky. It's the story of a morally bankrupt man named Fyodor Karamazov and his 3 sons. To spill the beans in a few sentences so that you can start to grasp an understanding, the 3 sons are very different. Alyosha Karamazov, the youngest son, is supposedly the main character. And I say supposedly because it's his oldest brother, Dmitri, who takes a lot of the spotlight in the book. But Dostoyevsky's insistence that Alyosha is the main character is quite interesting, and Alyosha kind of represents your view into Dostoyevsky's world. Alyosha is intelligent, he is pious, he's always trying to do the right thing, he's straightforward and honest with people, and you can kind of summarize his entire character with these 3 attributes. Honest, which I've said about 1,000 times, reverent, and loyal. Alyosha never, ever lies. He never goes back on promises, he always keeps his word, and he will always tell you what you think if you ask him. He says what he's going to do, and he always follows through. He's not technically a monk, however, he spends all of his time at the monastery studying under Elder Zosima, which is basically this mini Pope-esque character within Eastern Orthodoxy. I don't know too much about Eastern Orthodox Christianity or Russian Orthodox Christianity, except for what I've read in Dostoyevsky. But basically, Elder Zosima is this character with profound wisdom and insight. And Dostoyevsky drops these enormous truth bombs through this character that I'm sure we'll talk about. Well, I know that we'll talk about it. I've written about it. So we are going to talk about it. And Elder Zosima kind of represents Dostoyevsky's perfect religion exemplified, meaning if you could represent, what am I trying to say? If you could represent the religious worldview, the Christian worldview, if you could represent that perfectly, it would be Elder Zosima. That's kind of his figurehead for that. So Elder Zosima is very wise. People come to him from all over Russia for wisdom, advice, instruction, and even miracles. There's some superstition around some of the elders. But anyway, Alyosha is studying under Elder Zosima, along with the other monks who are also learning from him. And he hasn't sworn any oaths or vows or anything else. He hasn't actually committed to being a monk, but he's been hanging around and he has a good relationship with Elder Zosima. And Zosima loves him very much, and everyone loves Alyosha. He's bashful, he doesn't crudely joke or anything like that. He's a very pious young man. He never gossips or betrays any of his family, even though they get themselves in ridiculous trouble and are always embarrassing themselves. They are these people who are constantly falling in and out of social scandal, and but Alyosha will never talk bad about them. He'll never betray them. And even though he has every reason to, he sticks by them. His father is an absolute scoundrel, Fyodor Karamazov. He's a womanizer. He's an alcoholic. He's a blasphemer. He is not religious in the slightest. And then, of course, you have Alyosha's older brother, Dmitri, which would be Fyodor's first child. Dmitri is always up to no good. He is always in some kind of embarrassing situation. He's always getting into brawls at the tavern. He gambles too much. He starts a scene in the town hall all the time. He is constantly disrupting social norms and and being rude, and he parties all night and spends every last penny several times. But Alyosha sticks with him, and he supports him, and he talks with him, and he befriends him, and he tries to be a good influence on him. So now that I've told you about Dmitri and Alyosha, the oldest and the youngest son that Fyodor has, I want to tell you about the middle son, who is Ivan. Ivan Karamazov is without doubt the most fascinating character in the book. He is the most thoughtful and interesting atheist ever penned. And I have zero hesitation saying that. When Dostoyevsky wants to embody an idea, he does not strawman that incarnation. Ivan is brilliant, he is honorable, he is a soldier, he is respectable, he's a very good guy in the sense that when you're reading about him, he never rubs you the wrong way. He's always thoughtful, he's always interesting. But behind closed doors, when it's just you and him, and if the conversation goes to religion, Ivan will absolutely decimate your arguments for Christianity. He is a blistering critic of Christianity. He thinks that the idea of God is not only wrong, but if God exists, then he has a lot to answer for, basically, because of all the evil in the world. And so one of the premises of the book, one of the linchpins of the entire work, is this battle, so to speak, between Ivan and Alyosha, because Alyosha, of course, is incredibly pious, very much believes in God, lives by Scripture's teachings, prays every night, spends his days in the monastery, and all of these kinds of things. And whenever he interacts with his brother, the conversation inevitably goes to Christianity. And Ivan just has these blistering attacks on Christianity that Alyosha cannot answer. He cannot answer the objections that to Ivan's philosophy. He does not know what to say. But as the story plays out, you can see the worldview that each of these characters have manifesting in each of their lives, and it's almost as if the arguments don't even matter. And so we'll talk about that, and that is very fascinating. So one thing I want to say is that when Ivan and Alyosha talk about Christianity, they don't talk like maybe your family might this Thanksgiving. By the way, today's Thanksgiving. Happy Thanksgiving. Thank you for listening. But when Alyosha and Ivan talk about Christianity, they don't talk about it like a bickering family where they're hurling chairs and stuff by the end and they're just shouting past each other. No, it's not like that at all. They very intensely listen to one another, and it's clear that they really are willing to grapple with the truth. They're willing to grapple with the arguments, with the facts. But Ivan's intellect and his arguments are just vastly superior. Alyosha never knows what to say in the arguments. He just ends up listening as Ivan just berates the idea that there could ever be a loving God in this cruel and horrible universe. And so I'm dedicating an entire episode to that because it is very, very good. But what I actually want you to see is that there are different kinds of atheists and different kinds of Christians in the Brothers Karamazov. Ivan does respect Alyosha. Actually, everybody respects Alyosha because they can see that he is serious in what he believes. And even if he can't necessarily defend what he believes, you can tell he actually believes it and he lives by it. And that process of walking the walk and talking the talk, so to speak, will always earn you respect, as it does Alyosha. Fyodor, these three brothers' father, is a scoffer. He's definitely an atheist, but he is much more concerned with the shallow objections to Christianity. He says things all the time like, oh, all those priests, they're just hypocrites, and I'd go to church except for that I hate church, and and by the way, did you see Sister so-and-so? Too bad she's a nun, eh? That's kind of Fyodor Karamazov. He's just a scoundrel. He's just a kind of a gross person, and Christianity would get in his way of having fun, and so he just will laugh at Christianity. He just doesn't take it seriously at all. Ivan takes it seriously. He knows the arguments. He knows the conversation, but he agrees with Fyodor, obviously. But Ivan's big thing is that he is furious at God for thinking that the suffering in the world is worth anything that could ever be a higher good. He just thinks that the suffering exhibited by children, for example, is an unforgivable offense. The suffering of one single child is not worth any possible greater good that could ever come out of it. And so the idea that there's a good God in the world who orchestrates things for the good of those who love him is so offensive to Ivan that he will shred you to scraps if you approach him with that kind of an argument. He has all of these examples waiting. He has all of these arguments waiting, and he's just ready to tear you a new one intellectually if you're going to try to stand up and defend God. And again, Ivan could have been a lawyer. He is cunning. He is brilliant. He is absolutely devastating with his arguments against Christianity. And Ivan Karamazov represents Dostoyevsky's most substantial and serious reservations with the Christian worldview. And when he goes at it, there are fireworks. And so we're going to talk about a lot of those conversations, and it's going to be incredible. I'm really excited about it, so I'll stop ranting about it. I don't think the backstory of these characters are too important, their childhood, where they came from. I'll just say that Fyodor, as you might expect, was not a good father at all. He completely neglected all three of his children. If he had enough money, he would send them to boarding schools and things, and that was the best days of their lives. Fyodor had two wives. The first one bore him Dmitri, and the second one bore him Ivan and then Alyosha. And both of the wives are now dead or out of the picture. And the first wife that he had is where he got a lot of his wealth. When she died, she was very wealthy. And so she wrote a will with Dmitri in it and specifically said, this money is for Dmitri's education, for his upbringing, and then there was a large sum that he was supposed to receive after he graduated. So a lot of the conflict in the novel, or at least the first one, is Dmitri wanting the inheritance that he's owed, that Fyodor has. And Fyodor argues, I've already given it to you. I've already given it to you. I've been giving you thousands of rubles throughout the years in letters and things. And Dmitri doesn't deny that. It's just that by his own calculations, he is owed more. And so the financial dispute between these two characters ends up growing and escalating. There's one more family dynamic that you need to be aware of. So obviously, Fyodor cheated on both of his wives many times. And one day, there was a woman in town who everybody knew, and she went in and out of homelessness, but she was quite beautiful. And then she became mysteriously pregnant. And there were rumors that the child belonged to Fyodor. And these rumors were more or less confirmed. When the woman was giving birth, she did it in Fyodor's garden. And so Grigory, who is Fyodor's chief servant, took him in to his household because him and his wife had just gone through a miscarriage. And so they raised the child as their own. And they also practically raised all three of the boys. I mean, Fyodor was, to say he was not interested in his children is the understatement of the century. He did not care about his children. And so Grigory ended up basically raising all three children, or arranging their financial affairs so they could go to school. Very pious, good guy, Grigory. Very simplistic, has no arguments for Christianity also. But there you have it. So anyway, this orphan, this half-brother, his name is Smedjikov. And Smedjikov will become a very important character because he grows up as an illegitimate son of Fyodor. And so therefore, he's a servant, he's a serf, he's a cook. And so a lot of the conversations that take place in the living room between Ivan and Fyodor and Grigory and Alyosha, when they're all kind of debating or joking around, in the case of Fyodor, about religion and Christianity, Smedjikov is always a fly on the wall. So whenever there's a deep conversation going on, Smedjikov is listening. Or a financial conversation where they're talking about how much Fyodor has and how much Fyodor plans on giving to his children when he dies and those kinds of things. Smedjikov is always listening. And no one ever really knows that he's listening. No one knows how smart Smedjikov is because he's just a serf, after all. He's just a cook, after all. But Smedjikov knows who he is. He knows that he is supposedly Fyodor's son, and he is very clever in that he never does anything wrong. He returns money if it's lost. He has completely earned the trust of everyone who knows him. However, he's been listening to Ivan, and he is convinced by Ivan's arguments of atheism, and he even has some arguments against Christianity of his own that are interesting. So we'll talk about those too. But The center conflict that we need to start talking about already is the financial disputes, or really just the disputes in general, between Dmitri and Fyodor, the father and the son. Dmitri being the son, of course. But there's not just that, right? Dmitri thinks that his father owes him tens of thousands of rubles, potentially, by his calculations, but he'll settle for just 3,000 rubles. But Fyodor has decided, no, I've given you everything, I'm not giving you a single more penny. But it's not just that. There's also a girl. You see, Dmitri was engaged to a nice woman of high society named Katerina Ivanovna. And in case you have read Crime and Punishment, yes, that Katerina Ivanovna, as in Katerina Ivanovna, who is the poor woman in St. Petersburg who ends up marrying the drunk Marmeladov and rears many children, of whom the eldest is Sonia. Sonia, the prostitute, who has faith in Christ for her redemption and is the pivotal catalyst for Raskolnikov's redemption. So that's kind of a crazy thing. Brothers Karamazov almost acts like a prequel in some sense to Crime and Punishment, because we see Katerina Ivanovna before she is who we know her as the poor, miserable woman who allows her eldest daughter to go into prostitution to keep the family afloat. But anyway, so we see Katerina Ivanovna kind of where she came from, and she's rich, and she's lovely, and she's engaged to Dmitri, and by the way, how come nobody talks about this? Am I the only one who's read both books and is noticing this crossover? I literally didn't know this until I read it and was like, what? This Katerina Ivanovna, she has the same backstory, same parents, same everything, and it's like, it's got to be the same character, right? Anyway, Dmitri is engaged to Katerina, and in true Karamazov fashion, he breaks up with her on a whim because he's fallen head over heels in love with this other girl named Grushenka. Now, Grushenka is a truly devious woman. She has spun herself into a web, a love triangle, where both Fyodor and Dmitri, father and son, are infatuated with her. They would do anything for her love. And to make matters worse, Ivan Karamazov also loves Katerina Ivanovna. So there is not one, but two love triangles in this book. Grushenka has a relationship, or off and on again relationship, sort of relationship, with both Dmitri and Fyodor. And then Katerina was just engaged to Dmitri for the longest time, but now is supposedly in love with Ivan. And so there are two love triangles in this book that involve like all five characters. Alyosha is the only character who's kind of looking at all of this being like, y'all are crazy. But anyway, the love triangles aren't too important. That's probably the last time you'll hear of them. They are important to the book itself, but that's kind of just plot details and other things that probably won't be relevant for our conversation. The important part to remember is that the relationship between Fyodor and Dmitri, the father and son relationship, is strained not only for financial reasons, but also because both of them love the same girl. And both of them are convinced that the girl could rush into the hands of the other immediately because she is so unpredictable and reckless. So they just feel tentatively like if they don't marry this girl right now, then Grushenka could at any moment go into the rival's arms and marry them instead. One other minor detail that's worth 10 seconds to say is that Dmitri has borrowed money from his ex-fiancée, Katerina Ivanovna, and so he also feels like he needs to pay Katerina Ivanovna his debt back before his honor can be restored to him so that he can go marry Grushenka. So he wants the 3,000 rubles so that he can pay Katerina Ivanovna back and then marry Grushenka. And so that's why he desperately wants the money from Fyodor. And Fyodor knows this, so Fyodor is not going to give him a penny because he knows that if he gives Dmitri any money, then he's going to marry Grushenka, pay off Katerina Ivanovna, and then be off into the countryside with youthful abandon. And so what Fyodor has, what Fyodor lacks in looks, because he's an older gentleman, he makes up for with his wealth. And Grushenka knows that, and Dmitri knows that. Okay, so now we have a story, a real conflict. So that's not the only conflict in the book. So again, you need to remember that Smedjikov has become a hardcore atheist after listening to many conversations between Fyodor, who's a scoffing atheist, and Ivan, who's an intellectual and existential atheist. And Fyodor is a brute, but Ivan is brilliant. And they have unwittingly convinced Smedjikov that God does not exist, and that morals are a social construct, and that there is no such thing as an intrinsically evil deed. And Smedjikov ends up with some clever criticisms of Christianity himself. He argues that a faith-based salvation system is pretty ridiculous, since we are not directly in charge of our beliefs, and that we cannot help but doubt God's goodness when trials come. And so, therefore, it's not really fair to say that you have to have faith when, if your faith is challenged, it's not really your fault, and then you lose your faith because something hard comes along, and then it's like, oh, sorry, I guess you don't get to go to heaven. He mocks that. And so Smedjikov kind of finds his atheism in the middle. He's a little bit of a scoffer, but he's pretty intellectual too. He's a pretty smart guy. He also points out that Scripture itself seems to indicate that nobody has even a mustard seed of faith, because if they did, then they should be able to move mountains, according to Jesus. When Jesus curses the fig tree and it withers immediately, his disciples marvel at this. And Jesus says, if you have even the faith of a mustard seed, if you had a tiny amount of faith, you'd be able to say to that mountain, be cast into the sea, and it would obey you. And since nobody has ever demonstrated the ability to toss a mountain into the sea, it stands to reason that either nobody has ever had even a mustard seed worth of faith, or that Jesus was a Looney Tune. So Grigory, who is Smedjikov's adopted father and Fyodor's chief servant, is very offended at his adopted son's opinions, and he says that Ivan has poisoned his mind, while Smedjikov merely says that he is using his mind. Kind of the classic back and forth, low-tier poop slinging between a believer and an atheist that today you might see in a comment section or something. So both Grigory and Smedjikov, and Fyodor kind of engage in a low-tier, surface-level conversation that's very superficial, while Ivan and Alyosha engage in some real conversations that are chilling, to say the least. But check this out. This is the linchpin of the story. You have the conflict between Dmitri and Fyodor, but then Smedjikov sees an opportunity. Smedjikov is a slave, essentially, to Fyodor for life, for as long as Fyodor is alive. And Dmitri Karamazov absolutely hates him. He hates his father. And so Smedjikov sees, there's a motive for murder here. And the tension in the household is through the roof over these weeks that unfold in the novel. And Smedjikov realizes that if Fyodor marries Grushenka, then Grushenka will inherit all of Fyodor's money when he dies. And given the romantic tension and the love triangle, Fyodor would marry Grushenka the very hour that she would agree to it. So time is of the essence. And all of the brothers stand to gain a lot of money. Smedjikov reckons up to 35,000 rubles each if Fyodor dies before he marries Grushenka. And, since Dmitri has so obviously incriminated himself with threats of violence multiple times, he has very good and varied reasons why he would want to murder his father. If Dmitri went down for the murder of his father, he would forfeit his share of the inheritance. And so if he's convicted of murder, each son, meaning Ivan and Alyosha, would get close to 45,000 rubles or more. And Smedjikov would become a free man. And so as long as Smedjikov could plan a murder perfectly, Dmitri would take the fall. And I'm explaining this to you afterwards, but when you're reading the novel, you're not thinking about any of this. Dostoyevsky interweaves these details, of course, and so when it happens and Smedjikov explains his reasoning for murdering Fyodor, you're like, oh my gosh, like that makes perfect sense. So there's this eerie conversation between Smedjikov and Ivan Karamazov as the tension is just absolutely at its peak. Ivan is fed up with all of the drama between Fyodor and Dmitri. And he has broken off forever any relationship with Katerina Ivanovna, ending one of the love triangles. And Ivan is feeling very emotionally frustrated because he realizes that Katerina really only loved Ivan in order to try to make Dmitri jealous. And so he is sick and he's tired of being the arbiter between Fyodor and Dmitri. He lives at Fyodor's house. He lives with his father. And so whenever Dmitri comes over, whatever, he always has to, play the middleman. And he's done. He's sick of being the middleman. Dmitri has threatened to kill his father many times. And then he finally did actually burst in during dinner when Ivan and Fyodor and Alyosha were all talking about Christianity. And Dmitri busts in and just starts beating the crap out of Fyodor. And everyone is trying to restrain Dmitri, but he got quite a few good licks in. So the next day, Ivan says, "That's it. I'm done. I'm going to Moscow," I think it was Moscow. And Smedjikov, who has been thinking about all of the benefits that would befall the brothers and himself if Fyodor was killed by Dmitri, takes Ivan's departure to mean, my father is no longer under my protection, and I accept that Dmitri will probably kill him, and that's fine with me. And so Smedjikov is playing this three-dimensional chess game, where he's thinking to himself, And so he proceeds to have a multi-layered conversation with Ivan, where he says, "Now, master, surely you shouldn't go to Moscow, but instead to this other place." I forget the location. But it was a city that was much, much closer, about a day's travel instead of, 4 days travel. And Ivan goes, "Well, why would I want to do that?" And Smedjikov says, "Well, you were considering representing your father in a business deal there, weren't you?" And Ivan says, "Well, yeah, I suppose so, but it's probably not going to work out, and that's an errand for my father, and I don't feel like doing an errand for my father. And again, it's just kind of a dumb thing. I'm not going to do it." But Smedjikov insists. He says, "But are you sure that you don't want to do your father a favor and be a little bit closer?" So Ivan says, "Okay, you're right. Fine, whatever. I'll go there instead." And so Smedjikov arranges the transportation, and then on Ivan's way out, he says this fateful line. He says, "It is always nice to talk to an intelligent man, sir." And Ivan doesn't get it. He just says, "Yeah, sure, of course it is." But for Smedjikov, he has taken all of this as an affirmative nod to kill Fyodor and let Dmitri take the fall. And maybe Ivan would even give Smedjikov a few thousand rubles for him to start a new life in Paris. And so in case my explanation wasn't clear, what is essentially happening is that Smedjikov convinced Ivan to not travel too far away because Ivan was the protector of Fyodor. And so after Ivan leaves, Smedjikov says, "Well, why don't you just you should leave for sure, but don't go too far. After all, something may happen. You might need to come back and plan a funeral." He doesn't say that, but that's what he implies. And so when Ivan says, "Okay, I won't go to Moscow, I'll go to a closer city," Smedjikov takes that to mean green light to kill Fyodor and let Dmitri take the fall. So, on a mysterious and fateful night, Dmitri is in a flustered state. He hears that Grushenka has gone off with her old ex-husband, this old flame of hers. And so Grushenka has run off to a neighboring town, supposedly, and Dmitri must go to her. He must see if Grushenka really is not going to marry either him or his father. And so, as he's running off, he realizes, wait, but what if it's a trick? What if Grushenka wants Dmitri to think that she is out of town when really she is with Fyodor, who is laughing at him right now, his arms around his girl? And so he storms off to Grushenka's house to talk to her maids, who don't know anything. And so Dmitri he doesn't believe the maids when they say, "We don't know anything, we think Grushenka's out of town." He thinks it's all a trick. And so he grabs this pestle and he bolts off in the direction of his father's house. And when he gets there, he climbs over the fence and he starts looking at the windows to try to see if his father is around. And he does see him in the window, and he's leaning out the window and he's saying, "Grushenka, are you there? Are you there?" And so he decides that he's going to see if he can slink around. And as he's slinking, he's making quite the ruckus. And so Grigory comes out. And when he sees Grigory, he strikes him on the head with a pestle, and he falls down. And he comes over to him, and he pulls out his handkerchief, and he is trying to clean the blood and see if he's dead. And he isn't able to assess anything. And so he drops the pestle and he runs away with the bloody handkerchief. Well, satisfied that Grushenka is not with Fyodor, Dmitri decides to go out in a blaze of glory. He will catch up to Grushenka and Grushenka's ex-husband, and he will interact with them and he will throw a party with all of the money that he has left that he was unable to receive, and then he will kill himself. And so he goes and he talks with some people, and he pawns some of his little belongings in order to pay for the fare. And when he gets there, he throws this big party. And it turns out that Grushenka does love Dmitri after all, and that she is not in love with her ex-husband, who she had thought that she was actually in love with all of this time. And so Dmitri is thinking, well, maybe life is worth living and maybe everything could be okay. Well, unfortunately for him, he is surprised in the wee small hours of the morning when police have the building surrounded and they storm in and they arrest Dmitri on the charge of murder, since Fyodor has turned up dead in his house, bludgeoned to death by a single strike to the head. So Dmitri is absolutely flabbergasted. He has no idea why his father is dead. He thought that he killed Grigory, which is reasonable, and he was very afraid that Grigory would not survive his injuries. But when he hears that Grigory has indeed survived and is accusing him of murder, he's like, "What are you talking about? I didn't murder him. I just went to see if Grushenka was there." And so there's this immediate tension where the entire world thinks that Dmitri is absolutely guilty because he looks guilty as all get out. Smedjikov has had a falling fit because he has a neurological condition where sometimes he has a seizure, and so he has done one of these. Little does anyone know that he actually has learned to fake them. And so now Smedjikov is in the hospital. He was unconscious all night, supposedly, and Dmitri looks like he has been squarely accused and condemned of murder. There is absolutely no way that Dmitri's getting out of this. But still, he pleads innocent. All of the investigations are carried out. Dmitri is now arrested and awaiting a murder trial. And Ivan and Alyosha and everyone else are just absolutely reeling. They cannot believe that Dmitri actually did follow through with the murder. And Ivan and Alyosha do not believe that Dmitri is the murderer, but everyone else is like, come on, the writing is absolutely on the wall. The evidence all points to Dmitri's guilt. But here's the thing. Ivan keeps going back and forth. He says, no, my brother must be guilty. But then he goes and he talks to Smedjikov, and Smedjikov says some pretty suspicious things and has some winks kind of going on. And so Ivan says, whoa, what is going on here? And so he goes and he talks to Smedjikov a few times. And finally, Smedjikov says, wait, do you really not get it? And Ivan says, no, what do you mean? And Smedjikov says, I'm the one who killed Fyodor, right? I mean, we kind of talked about this, didn't we? Didn't you wink at me? Didn't you tell me implicitly that you wanted me to kill your father when you left for this city instead of Moscow? Didn't you realize that if Fyodor marries Grushenka, then you wouldn't get any inheritance? Didn't you realize that Dmitri is going to go down for this, and therefore you're going to get a massive inheritance, and I have my freedom now? And Ivan is absolutely flabbergasted. He feels horribly guilty because in his heart of hearts, he realizes that he is complicit in his father's death. And so he's thinking back to this conversation where Smedjikov was like, yeah, remember? And then I said to you, it's always nice to talk to an intelligent man. And you said, yes, it is, and drove off in the carriage. And Ivan is sitting there wide-eyed like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe that Dmitri is innocent and that you are the actual killer. And no one is ever going to believe that. So there's this arc that Ivan goes on where Smedjikov says, see, aren't you proud of me, Ivan? Look at this. I got away with this, just like you said. Anything is permissible, right? Anything's permissible. I did something and I got away with it due to my cunning and my intelligence. Look at me. Aren't you proud of me? Your little atheist spawn. And Ivan, of course, is not proud. He's horrified. And Smedjikov is amazed that Ivan is not on his side. Smedjikov is like, well, wait a minute. We talked about this. We talked in code, didn't we? And Ivan realizes that there is no way that any of the world will ever believe that Smedjikov is actually the murderer. The evidence is so condemning towards Dmitri that Smedjikov is going to get away with it. And Ivan has to ask himself, is justice real? And see, this is where the Brothers Karamazov kind of touches Crime and Punishment, because Ivan's arc is this, where he realizes, do I believe in justice or not? Am I going to stand up for what's quote-unquote right, or do I believe that anything is permissible? And so Ivan starts to realize that his worldview is going to come crashing in conflict with what he believes is right and just. And so Smedjikov is absolutely stunned. He's like, well, Ivan, what are you getting cold feet now? We're in this together, don't you understand? You're just as much the murderer as me. And Ivan is saying, no, that's not true. Well, when Ivan goes home and he starts to become delirious as he's coming down sick and he's thinking through all of these things like, oh my gosh, word comes that Smedjikov has killed himself. And now Ivan is the only person in the world who knows that Smedjikov is the murderer. But what is he going to do? Is he going to actually try to testify in court that Smedjikov told him that he was the murderer? That's not going to work. All of the evidence points to Dmitri. And besides, why would Ivan even want to do that? Ivan should just let Dmitri take the fall, and then Ivan can get all of the inheritance and all of the money, and that'll be the end of it, right? Anything is permissible. Who cares? Ivan's not even that close to Dmitri. But Ivan realizes that justice is this fixed feature of the universe, that he cannot just turn a blind eye. But then again, can he? He wrestles with his own slogan, which is, without God, anything is permissible. And he realizes that if he stands for the truth and against everyone says, no, Dmitri is actually innocent, first of all, no one will believe him. And second of all, he will lose his social stature that he loves so much. People will consider him a Looney Tune. They will say that he's lost his mind, that he's abandoned reason, that he's just decided to stay with his brother, even though his brother is clearly guilty. And so Ivan starts to go insane. He doesn't know what he's going to do. So I'm going to take that plot arc and set it aside, and we will pick it up again when I pick up the prosecutor's speech. And I would say that this is really the heart of the plot. And Dostoyevsky structured the novel to where another atheist character, who is hardcore atheist, has to realize that if God does not exist, anything's permissible. And again, this is something that he said routinely, but now he has to face the question of, am I going to actually live like that? Because if I was being smart, I'd let Smedjikov get away with it. I would even give Smedjikov some of my inheritance, and I would move on with my life. But he can't do that. And so he tells Smedjikov off, and he storms out of the room. And as he's plotting to try to get Smedjikov in some kind of illegal trap, word arrives through Alyosha that Smedjikov has killed himself. And now Ivan is trapped. He is alone in his atheism, and he is alone to figure this out. Well, the other moral heart of Dostoyevsky's novel is this relationship between Ivan and Alyosha. Because even though Ivan is superior intellectually and can crush Alyosha's arguments, they're still good friends, and they grow close in their mutual defense of Dmitri. Alyosha defends Dmitri because he believes Dmitri, while Ivan believes Dmitri because Smedjikov told him that he was actually the murderer. But Ivan is supposed to have the worldview that says, don't worry about it. And so Ivan is racked with guilt for allowing his father's death and being in some sense complicit in the murder, and also realizing that he's going to throw away his social status, his inheritance. He's going to throw away everything in order to try to defend the truth, or he can just let it go. But he can't let it go. And so he starts to descend into madness as he tries to iron all of this out. Well, there's one more significant part of Dostoyevsky's novel that we're going to talk about extensively in another episode. It's Dostoyevsky's struggle with the question of the problem of evil. And this is Ivan's chief argument against Alyosha, where he points out the evil in the world and says there's no way a good and loving God has created this or permits this to happen. There's no way that God could ever justify his actions. And then there's also the problem of natural evil. Is life fundamentally worth the suffering? Is God justified in creating? Is what God created actually good? Is life essentially a miserable, pain-wreaked existence that you have to suffer through for some quote-unquote higher good or higher harmony, as Ivan calls it? Because when you're standing at the grave of your child, you have a hard time justifying why any of it would be worth it. Why is life worth it if you can experience such lows, such pain? How could anything be worth that suffering? And so, again, you have Dostoyevsky putting the most challenging struggles of his life and the most challenging objections to Christianity in the voice of one of his characters, and then we see that reality play out. Dostoyevsky doesn't deny in the slightest that life is hard. As a matter of fact, just a few months before actually sitting down and writing out the entire novel, Dostoyevsky's own son, named Alyosha, died of epilepsy. And so Dostoyevsky is very well acquainted with the grief of having a dead child. And he writes this into the novel. I don't mean his child's death. I mean the struggles with life, the struggles of asking existence, of asking God, if you will, why this? Why does this have to be the case? And so there's a child that Alyosha befriends. Alyosha is just kind of the kind of guy who is who all the schoolboys know him and like him, and he plays with them and that kind of a thing. And the little boy's name is Ilyushka. And Ilyushka ends up dying fairly young. Very young. I mean, he's a schoolboy. And so we get to see these characters, and Alyosha specifically, process the death of a child and the burial of a child and the hysterics of the father, as he's a poor man and he's a miserable man, and then now he has a dead son, and the family just crumbles apart. And we get to see the reality of life and the reality of life's struggles and challenges. And so we're going to go in depth with all of Dostoyevsky's thoughts, all of his portrayals of these things over the next few weeks, and I think it's going to be a very, very good series. Brothers Karamazov is the pinnacle of Dostoyevsky's work, which centered largely around a devastating critique of European Enlightenment ideals and premises being taken to their logical conclusion, namely atheism, secularism, utopianism, and utilitarianism. Dostoyevsky just lays waste to these ideas. He unleashes an existential war cry against those philosophies, saying that man is not essentially rational. We are not capable of utopia. We're not even interested in an easy life. We want the struggle. We need the struggle. We find our very meaning in our suffering. And when we aren't suffering, then we invent suffering. You know this firsthand. I know you do. When you know people whose lives are just a little too easy, and so they make up drama and they stir conflict and are depressed and anxious and just because the suffering, according to Dostoyevsky, is a central tenet of what it means to be human. Free will, the nearly unbearable burden of having to choose discipline and love and faith rather than nihilism and pleasure and death. That is the human condition. The unbearable freedom of having to force yourself to choose the good. That is a far more accurate representation of reality than, well, just do the reasonable thing and do the rational thing. And reason would state that if we all just did this, then we could live in a utopia. Dostoyevsky just hurls that against the wall and smashes it with his critiques. And the struggle between good and evil, says Dostoyevsky, is not a struggle between reason and irrationality. It is a struggle between malevolence and nihilism and virtue and redemption. And that's the right way to think about it. Those who are malevolent and nihilistic are angry at the world. They're angry that dead children exist. They're angry that God decided to create. They're angry that they were ever born. And they are violent, and they are intelligent, and they have nothing to lose. And if you want to hear more about that, go and listen to our series on Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals. He depicts that perfectly. But on the other side, Dostoyevsky saw virtue and redemption, which are exactly grounded and upheld by the reality of God and the power of Christ. So that's the right framework to think about it. It's not reason versus irrationality. That's just the wrong way to conceptualize the issue. It's deeper. It's more profound. It's more real. It's that the forces of evil have found a way to rationalize mass murder and nihilism, and the culture has been persuaded to dismiss Christianity as folklore and myth, and they've decided that nothing bad could ever happen by resting the foundation of morality, purpose, and law on the backdrop of reason instead of revelation. And as soon as that happens, people quickly realize that reason is a two-way street, and you can rationalize putting a Jew in an oven the same way you can rationalize putting a pizza in an oven. And Dostoyevsky saw that. He was a visionary and a prophet. He saw that nihilism and totalitarianism was coming in Russia, and the only force in the world that could stop it was a radical return to Christianity. And his warnings were not heeded. And the world was taught a harsh lesson. And only time will tell if it is a lesson that we've actually learned. Well, as the prosecutor stands up and he says that the Karamazovs are a picture of all of Russia. Just as you can see the sun in a raindrop, you can see the nation in the Karamazovs. And just as Dmitri is a strange mixture of passion, honor, and also nihilism and wickedness, so is the irrationality of man. And suddenly Ivan comes bursting into the courtroom. He is twitching and is talking to himself. Everybody turns and looks at him as he makes his way to the center. And then he suddenly says, "Smedjikov's the murderer." And everybody looks at him completely puzzled. And so he shouts it, "Smedjikov is the murderer!" And he says it over and over and over again. And pretty soon guards are coming to start taking him away. And there's a huge ruckus going on. And Ivan has completely lost his mind. The novel is open-ended about the fate of Ivan and whether he comes around again or whether he's just completely lost to himself. Well, after the prosecutor's speech finally ends, the jury goes into the other room and deliberates for 2 hours and comes out and delivers the verdict. Dmitry Karamazov is guilty of all charges. And the book ends. Thank you for listening to the podcast. Please join me for the next few episodes. I think they are very, very important. And until next time.